In this lecture video, we're going to be looking at some of the core features of Jean-Jacques Rousseau's The Social Contract. So we first have to understand the context of the social contract and how it follows some of his earlier, perhaps more pessimistic works of politics and philosophy. So one of the things that he argues in the second discourse is that human beings are good by nature, but they are rendered corrupt by society. So, contrary to Hobbes, it is not that human beings are naturally selfish. This is actually a feature of how society operates because we continually compare ourselves to one another, and then we seek this kind of recognition, but it's a kind of recognition that is not necessarily a virtuous kind, right? It is full of vain and pride, as Rousseau calls it, amor propria. Furthermore, private property is the origin of civil inequality. And we have then an account of the origin of government as it relates to private property, which then tells us about the origin of social inequality. The origin stories of Hobbes and Locke, according to Rousseau, are wrong, right? Where Hobbes says the government is founded by ultimately subduing to the will of someone who's stronger for the sake of, guaranteeing security for myself, which guarantees security for all. And Locke says, well, look, we use reason to reflect hypothetically on what our life would be like in government compared to the state of nature, and we can see our natural rights of life, liberty, and property would be better protected by living under a government than in the state of nature. So we also enter government through our own self-interest, but in this way, it's not a kind of selfish self-interest, it's a rational self-interest, whereas with Hobbes's, it's just full selfishness. But Rousseau argued that's not correct. The origin is actually a ruse, a trick played on the majority of people who, the have-nots, right? We have a minority of people who over time come to own more property, and they realize it's in their own self-interest to trick the masses into obeying a government, telling them, look, you'll have all these rights and we'll protect you and things like that. When in reality, they would have been better off if they had never agreed to this contract in the first place. So it seems kind of pessimistic, right? The state of nature was better for human beings, although there are some instances where we were, metaphysically unfree, politically free in the state of nature. But then in society, Rousseau argues we are metaphysically free because of our ability then to use reason and develop long-term projects and not be bound by our instincts. But on the other hand, we're politically unfree because we have to submit to the will of a sovereign. So it would seem like, well, we want to go back, right, to the state of nature. But Rousseau says we cannot go back. Our social nature is now effectively a second nature. We cannot undo the history of civilization. So what can we do then? And here in the social contract, Rousseau is going to set out to explain when a government is legitimate. What then is the best possible form of government? The question of the social contract for Rousseau, as he says, is how to find a form of association that defends and protects the person and goods of each associate with all the common force, and by means of which each, uniting with all, nonetheless obeys only himself and remains as free as before. So we want to know, look, what is the kind of government where we can say we can protect the freedom and rights of the individual while also not abandoning the common interest of all in a society and the power of the government as it requires? So a couple questions follow from this. Can there be any legitimate and reliable rule in civil order? Can that reliable and legitimate rule account for human nature? Or would it be utopian to imagine such a form of government? Can it join both what natural right permits and what is the common interest? Can it ensure justice and utility? So, in other words, right, what is just, what is required, morally speaking, perhaps, and what is expedient, what is useful? Can it ensure that those two things are not at odds? Can freedom and authority be reconcilable? Two considerations first. What Rousseau calls the first law of humans. This is the natural right, the natural ability to be able to enter into associations, to have this freedom to, through my own will, desire and seek something or refrain from it. He says, this common freedom of voluntary association is a consequence of man's nature, right? So the common freedom of being able to enter into a group or leave a group, it's the consequence of man's first nature. And that first nature is the will, being able to will something. His first law is to attend to his own preservation. His first cares are those he owes himself. And since, as soon as he has attained the age of reason, he alone is the sole judge of the means proper for preserving himself, he thereby becomes his own master. Talking about, right, our will, the ability to rationally reflect on what we think is best and what we desire, what we see fit for ourselves. Another consideration we have to think about is the difference between natural and conventional rights. So the natural right is this ability to pursue the will, which is the first law of human beings, this the will to enter and leave an association. Natural rights are just actually one, this kind of freedom of the will. But all the other rights that John Locke speaks of property, of the kind of civil freedom that he speaks of, these are actually, for Rousseau, conventional rights. The only natural right is the right to life, which is why the first law of human beings is to attend to our own self-preservation. Rousseau says, though, that the social order is a sacred right that serves as the basis for all the others. Yet this right does not come from nature. It is therefore founded on conventions. So we cannot then say, well, we turn to government to protect, for example, the right to private property, the right to civil freedom, when these things are actually only possible if there is a social order first. They come from society. So we can't then rely on government. We cannot seek a legitimate form of government by trying to reflect on what are those natural rights that a government ought to preserve. Because whatever those rights are that Locke speaks about, for example, these are really conventional rights. And we're really just asking, well, what are the rights that we think ought to exist, and then how that government ought to exist in light of those and in relation to those rights. So that question about rights, then, is actually a lot more open than Locke argued. So Rousseau is first going to overturn Hobbes's argument for a legitimate government when someone is subdued by someone else stronger, right? Because Hobbes says a government is legitimate when your existence is better than it would be in the state of nature. So for Hobbes, we can either agree to submit to someone more powerful, or they can basically conquer us. They can subdue us. And either way, they are right in doing so. But Rousseau is going to ask a simple question. How does one maintain power once they have subdued someone to their will? Well, the only way they can maintain power, it would seem, is to continually threaten or actually directly physically subdue someone. Because there's going to be a kind of reaction, a resistance to it. So you can't simply say, well, forever, then, if I'm one individual, I'm going to subdue someone else. Maybe you can, actually. Maybe you can say, look, I'm just going to lock you up in chains for the rest of your life, and that's how I'm going to maintain my power over you. that actually is a lot different when we're talking about a government. You can't have one individual that's going to lock up thousands or millions of people. They would have to, of course, get other people to follow their authority, and then, maybe then go lock up everyone else. But it's completely ridiculous, and it's definitely wouldn't be better, even in that case. Your life wouldn't be better if you're just in prison your entire life than in your existence in the state of nature. Well, we could say maybe then, instead of direct physical subduing of someone else, maybe what's involved in how one maintains their power over someone else once they have subdued them to their will is to have the threat of a sanction, right? It's the threat. And the other person can then say, well, I don't want to be punished. But what's going to prevent them from eventually saying, this is ridiculous? Why do I have to live my entire life in fear of being punished? What right does this other person have? And that's going to be the key, that questioning. What right does this other person have to hold their power, to force me to obey their authority? And Rousseau says the stronger is never strong enough to be forever the master unless he transforms his force into right and obedience into duty. The stronger is only strong enough to be forever the master if that force is transformed into an internal recognition by the one who's subdued by their power. To see, look, their authority is legitimate, right? They have a right to exercise that authority. And I have a responsibility, I have a duty to obey their authority. So there must be an acceptance from what we could call the internal point of view. I have to accept it myself. So there cannot just be mere brute power and force that maintains rule. You must have a kind of legitimacy that depends on the concepts of right and duty. Could we say, though, as is the question asked in Plato's Republic by Socrates, in which Thrasymachus argues that might does indeed make right? Rousseau asks, does might make right? Could we say then that through the forcing of someone else to follow and obey your authority, they then create right? Because their power is so strong, maybe someone is so overawed and just kind of overcome by your power that they see maybe it's in their own best interest or something like that to obey your power. Well, the problem is, of course, as soon as you turn away, as soon as you stop making those threats, well, it's not in their best interest anymore to obey your authority that you have backed by the threat of sanction or the threat of violence. And so Rousseau says, what is a right that perishes when force ceases? There is no right. If one must obey due to force, there is no need to obey due to duty. And if one is no longer forced to obey, one is no longer obligated to do so. So it is clear, therefore, that this word right adds nothing to force. There is no right that comes from force, that comes from strength, that comes from power. It's a separate moral category that depends on the legitimacy of the authority of the person exercising that force. They must, if they are to be right in their exercise of force, they must already have that right to exercise that force if someone else is going to be obligated to obey their authority. We're going to ask then, well, where does the duty come from? What gives someone that kind of authority such that the subjects then have a responsibility and a duty to obey that authority? We'll get to that in a moment. But a little bit longer on this question of, might making right. Because in Aristotle's Politics, he famously argues that there are certain people who are slaves by nature. And there are also libertarians who argue that one can actually sell themselves into slavery as long as it's voluntary. Here's the problem. Rousseau is going to ask, can a person actually sell themselves into slavery? What would be involved in selling yourself into slavery? And you have to think about this going back to the concept of the natural law of self-preservation and the natural right of the will. What is involved in selling yourself into slavery? It's a giving up of the will. When you are a slave, you no longer have a will. What is required for the will then to, sell yourself into slavery? To say, I want to sell myself into slavery. And Rousseau says, well, it's actually, we're speaking of the metaphysics here of the will and metaphysics of slavery. There's actually a contradiction. To sell yourself into slavery, you have to will that you have no will. And Rousseau doesn't see how it's possible that the will can will itself to have no will, because if it wills itself to have no will, there is no will to will oneself into slavery in the first place. So Rousseau thinks that no matter what conventions there are about the possibility of selling oneself into slavery, it is in contradiction and never justified. What about a people, right? Because Hobbes argues, well, all that matters is you have the sovereign who just keeps security, right? Such that you don't need some consent and perpetual, much less perpetual consent by those who are subject to the will and authority of the sovereign. So you can have someone who becomes the sovereign, and then generations later, people are still obligated to obey the authority of that sovereign. So it would seem then in this case that you would have then just children in future generations who have to obey the will of another. So can a people sell themselves into slavery? Well, if a person can't sell themselves into slavery because it's a contradiction of the will, how could a mass of people will that they have no will? That too then seems to be illegitimate. You cannot have a government that once established is legitimate in perpetuity. It would always need to be reestablished with every new generation. Further question. What about the right to rule through conquest, as Hobbes argues? Is there a right to enslave a person through conquest? And Rousseau says, a slave made through war is in no way committed to his master except to obey him insofar as he is forced to do so. So it's the same problem that we asked before, right? That might doesn't make right. As soon as there is no longer a direct force or a threat of violence, there is no duty to obey. And in fact, there is no duty to obey in the first place because it's just a matter of self-interest in obeying. One is forced to do so. Thus, he says, from whatever vantage point one looks at things, the right of slavery is null and void, not only because it is illegitimate, but because it is absurd and meaningless. These words, slavery and right, are contradictory. I am making an agreement with you entirely at your expense, and entirely to my benefit, which I will observe so long as I please, and which you will observe so long as I please. What ridiculousness, Rousseau says. So, there is no right to enslave someone else, no matter what, even through capturing someone else in battle, in war. There also is no right to, this idea of natural slavery of a whole people, which might be thought about in relation to the idea of the divine right of kings. And just lastly, I want to consider specifically when Rousseau mentions Aristotle. He says, and this is quite interesting, Aristotle had also said that men are not naturally equal, but that some are born for slavery and others for domination. So the claim we want to think about is that some people are born for slavery and others are born for domination. And Rousseau says Aristotle was right, but he mistook the effect for the cause. So he mistook the fact that people are slaves. That means they were naturally suited or it's a right for them to be slaves, when in fact it is the fact that they were kind of created in those conditions to be slaves that made them fit to be a slave. And the same thing with domination. He says, every man born in slavery is born for slavery. Nothing is more certain. You are conditioned through those circumstances. So of course that some people are born for slavery and others are born for domination. But the difference is that slaves lose everything in their chains, even the desire to leave them, he says. They love their servitude just as Ulysses' companions loved their brutishness. If there are slaves by nature, then it is because there have been slaves contrary to nature. That force made the first slaves, and their cowardice perpetuated them. Their being subdued into accepting and putting up with the force of someone else made them fit to be a slave. But there is no natural slavery. It always is a matter of convention. And here, as we have seen Rousseau argue, there is no right to enslave another. There's only brute force that can be used. And that brute force is illegitimate because one can never will themselves into slavery. So we've seen this issue then that Rousseau has tried to tackle, limiting the extent to which one can have power over someone else. And you might ask then, well, how can it ever be the case that a government could be legitimate? Because a government has to, it has to exercise power, right? If it has laws, you have to be punished for breaking those laws. Well, how could you ever say government is ever justified in punishing someone for breaking those laws if it seems like, well, you can't will that you have no will, and if you're going to be punished, you would have to give up, that will to not be punished. Rousseau was going to ask this general question in these terms: the basic concepts of freedom and authority. Now, he's argued that it is contradictory to will oneself into slavery because you would have to will that you have no will. Excuse me. You would have to will that you have no will. But what about freedom and authority? Is that in contradiction? Is it in contradiction to say, I freely submit to the authority of some other body? Well, if it's someone else, it seems like yes. But it seems like there's a way in which freedom and authority are not necessarily, in the abstract, contradictory. Because I can submit to the authority of my own will. So, for example, I can will that I lose weight, and I can come up with a whole plan of diet and exercise. But maybe one morning I wake up and I just don't feel like it. I just don't feel like following through with my plan to go to the gym like I said I wanted to do. Well, it wouldn't be in contradiction to obey and say, look, I have a duty. I came up with this plan. In terms of respecting myself, I ought to follow through with that plan that I came up with. It's not clear at all that there would be a contradiction with my obeying of my own will in those circumstances where I say, look, I have certain immediate desires, the desire to be lazy. And that's in contradiction with the will I have, which is to follow a plan of exercise and diet to lose weight and become healthier. By foregoing the following of those desires and the meeting of them, and instead following through and obeying my will to be healthier, I am not in contradiction, even though I'm going against what I immediately desire. And first, instead for the sake of some long-term goal. In those cases, it's clear then that freedom and authority are not necessarily contradictory. And this is because there's no contradiction in submitting to the authority of one's own will, where we can see, look, I sit back and I think, what do I really want? I come up with a goal. That's what I want to pursue. But of course, there are always going to be these moments when different passions and interests arise. And then I have to think, am I going to follow through with my plan? Is this really what I want or not? That's a different question than the political body, a political community, a government. Because when we ask the question, what about can a political community submit to the authority of their own will? It's not entirely clear what that would mean. How can there be a will of a political community? We can say there's a will of the individual. But what is the will of a political community? What would be required for that? Rousseau says that legitimate laws are founded on the general will of the citizens, such that the individual citizen living under the power of a state is only obeying their self as a member of the political community. So if there is to be a legitimate form of government, it is one which is a government that is based on and acts out the general will of those who have a duty to obey its laws. So Rousseau says, I say therefore that sovereignty, since it is nothing but the exercise of the general will, can never be alienated, it can never be removed from the people, and that the sovereign, which is nothing but a collective being, can be represented only by itself. Power may well be transferred, but not will. So we can transfer power, right? The ability to make decisions, carry out laws, and execute them to some other body of representatives. But we can never transfer our own will. Those representatives must always be acting on behalf of our will. Now, a few things to take note of. The particular will of individuals in society may or may not be in agreement with the general will. So there's a difference between the general will, which is the will of all, of the body, and the will of the individual. So it can be the case that some people have a different kind of interest, but yet the government acts contrary to that interest, or in a way slightly different than that interest. That would be no different than that I spoke about of the, I have the long-term plan for diet and exercise, but I wake up one day and I kind of have this particular interest to just be lazy that day, right? We can say then there are two divergent kinds of maybe interests, but the will is something autonomous. Whereas that desire to be lazy, maybe I can autonomously agree to be lazy. But in that moment, if I decide to succumb to my desires to just eat ice cream in the morning and watch some TV, I'm giving into instinct and the emotions and sensation and things like that. The general will is autonomous. It is a representation of what all of us want. But as we'll see, not the sum of all particular wills. Furthermore, Rousseau says that the general will tends toward equality, but it is not continually lasting, and it is always voluntary. So the general will must continually be renewed, so the legitimacy of a government must continually be renewed, because there are always going to be new things we're going to learn as people in society. New events arise, new information, our beliefs change as we grow, but there are also going to be new members of the political body, right? You're going to have people that die, maybe people that immigrate, new people that are born. So you cannot have a government that, when a constitution is ratified, that's it. Whoever lives under the authority of that government thousands of years, hundreds or thousands of years later, still has to obey that, the rule of and authority of that government. Rousseau would say, no, that's illegitimate. It has to be continually renewed. And he says, if then the people promises simply to obey, it dissolves itself by this act. It loses its status as a people. The moment there is a master, then, if people simply just decide to obey the authority of the representatives, you no longer have a government acting on behalf of the general will. There's no longer a sovereign. And from that point onward, the body politic is destroyed. There are two interpretations of the general will, two ways to understand it. So we have the particular will, which is, my will and your will and all the individual wills of everyone in society. But there's the general will, which is the will of all. What I'm calling the transcendental general will is the transcendental incarnation of the citizen's common interest that exists in abstraction from what any of them actually wants. Because I think, we would all admit there can be things that might be in a long-term interest which we don't realize or we don't really know is what we want. So, for example, we might say, look, it's in our long-term interest to have a healthy and stable society. But think about climate change. You might have a lot of people that don't believe in climate change, or they don't want to have to change maybe certain practices in their life that might be required to address climate change. Well, since the interest of everyone is a stable and healthy environment and community, it would require some kind of action towards addressing climate change. That might be, for example, reducing emissions, which could involve then eating less meat. It could involve then instead of flying all the time, we do things like turn to more public transportation, so less cars, which would increase the price of gas or things like that, oil or something like that. And that would be against the interests of course, people who have to who have to like drive to work and drive around to do things. But we wouldn't necessarily say that those actions that a government would be taking to try to address the problems of climate change would be against the general will, even though it would be against the particular interests of each person. Rousseau says, one always wants what is good for oneself, but one does not always see it. There is often a considerable difference between the will of all and the general will. The latter, so the general will, considers only the common interest, while the former, which is the will of all, considers private interest and is merely a sum of particular wills. It should be understood from this that what generalizes the will is less the number of voices than the common interest that unites them. So the general will is not simply determined by, in a sense, like tallying up, like, okay, what is your will? All right, what is your will? Okay, and then we add up and see, well, what is the sum total of all the particular wills? That's not it. It's something over and above the particular will of each, because it is the common interest of the body politic. In that way, then, the general will can be transcendental. It can be beyond, over and above. It can transcend, in other words, the particular wills of all, and yet be derived from the community as a whole. Now, the other way to understand the general will is procedurally. So what I'm calling the procedural general will is what the citizens of the state have decided together in their sovereign democratic assembly. Because Rousseau says, for a will to be general, it is not always necessary for it to be unanimous, but it is necessary that all the votes be counted. Any formal exclusion destroys the generality. So it can't just be the case that there are some wise rulers that are able to understand and just know, they're smarter, right? They know what is actually in the common interest of all, and we all just have to obey the laws they pass. That's not quite it. Everyone has to vote for those representatives, or even vote directly on issues. So just the mere fact of participation then in that procedure legitimizes the laws that are enacted as a result of that procedure. If you don't have the participation of all, then you don't have the process and the sovereignty of the body politic legitimized. So again, there's these two ways to understand the general will, which is transcendentally, but also procedurally, because it's not just that, a pure democracy, 51% of the vote says we want this thing, therefore it's the general will of all. Well, it still could, if people are thinking only in their particular interests, it still could be the case that the law passed isn't in the common interest of all. Because again, there's often a considerable difference between the will of all and the general will. So sometimes what is really in the common interest of all isn't known immediately or clearly by the public. And yet you still have to have the participation of all in the voting process. So Rousseau says the commitments that bind us to the social body are obligatory only because they are mutual, and their nature is such that in fulfilling them, one cannot work for someone else without also working for oneself. So why then is a government legitimate that operates according to the general will? Because we are effectively obeying only ourselves in obeying the laws of that government. But if a government is not based on the general will and does not enact laws that are for the sake of the common interest, that is an illegitimate government. And this is why we have this kind of paradoxical statement that one then is forced to be free. So can the freedom of the individual be reconciled with the authority of the state? This is what was asked in the beginning. And Rousseau has argued only if that state operates according to the general will can we say that individual freedom is reconciled with the authority of the state. Only then is a government legitimate. There are a few ways to kind of really parse this and see to what extent then can we say that society truly is free, and then what are some of the worries maybe that then start to verge on the potential totalitarian aspects, perhaps, of a government based on the general will. Well, one thing to take into account is that the state cannot examine or regulate the private beliefs of citizens. Because the government is not simply the sum of all particular wills, it wouldn't say, well, look, a majority are Christian, therefore the government is going to reflect the interests of Christians and it's going to be a Christian government. And anybody else having a different belief, would have to, be punished. A government based on the general will would have to tolerate pluralism. The state can also institute policies that benefit the many then and not just the rich. So in this way, we have a kind of more populist, it would seem, form of government. The state also then, here we can see the aspects that we would want in able to ensure kind of the means for the state to carry out the will. The state can enforce people to pay taxes, it can punish them for breaking the law, or it could send them to war to fight on behalf of the state, to defend the state. All of these things are simply aspects of the general will. They are really aspects in which you are obeying yourself as long as the government is acting out the common interest. There are some potential worries though, right? So if those first three things are things we would want that are good things in terms of the reconciling of, it would seem like freedom with authority, what about insincere voting? How can we be sure that, okay, everybody has to participate in voting, but how can we be sure that everyone is voting sincerely? Maybe someone doesn't really care and they just show up and they just fill out whatever, so they can just finish the voting and go back to whatever else they're interested in. Would that undermine the general will? And how would we know that this was occurring? What about only partial voting? In the United States, not everybody votes. Could we say then the United States would be an illegitimate form of government? We also have the problem about the voting minority, right? Because, well, we're talking about voting in a democratic assembly, and of course the majority wins. How can we still say, that the freedom of the individual is reconciled with the authority of the state if the minority has to simply follow through with what the majority has decided? Now, Rousseau's going to say, because even if they voted against it, their participation in the system is a legitimation of the body politic. There are actually early critics from Benjamin Constant and George Hegel who argued that because the general will lacked any grounding in an objective ideal of reason, the general will inevitably lead to the reign of terror that we saw in the French Revolution. Maybe some of this is seen in Rousseau's famous quote that whoever refuses to obey the general will be constrained to do so by the whole body, which means nothing else but that he will be forced to be free. Now, metaphysically, I think we can understand what it means to be forced to be free, and that, well, look, it's actually in your own interest. You just don't realize it. So we're not subduing you. You're not being enslaved when you have to obey the laws, because they're laws that are in your own interest. On the other hand, perhaps, putting aside metaphysically that idea of being forced to be free, politically it would seem like maybe there is clearly a tendency to abuse this idea that one can be forced to be free. So I think something, to think about is whether Rousseau's political philosophy is more totalitarian or more libertarian. There are certainly aspects of Rousseau's political philosophy wherein he clearly argues for and tries to defend the freedom of each individual, which is why you can't simply will yourself into slavery, and why the idea of natural slavery is contradictory. On the other hand, though, it seems like, well, as long as you have a government that acts in the common interest, they then are authorized and they have the right to pass laws that are in the common interest, even if an individual disagrees with them. So where would dissent be allowed? It would seem like dissent really wouldn't be allowed. Or, maybe would some kind of civil disobedience be allowed? Or would it mean that if you have civil disobedience, that's an illegitimate government in the first place? So just some things to think about.